Welcome to ClickPoint, where we explore how this powerful combination transforms lives across industries like education, technology, venture capital, and sustainability. Today, we are speaking to Betsy Corcoran, who is the co-founder and partner of Lede Labs, which is an amazing consultancy firm that works with edtech organizations, in addition to the co-host of the FutureFluent podcast, which focuses on how people learn, AI, and the future of literacy. In this conversation, the really interesting thing that we get into is the amazing connection and confluence within Betsy's life around journalism and technology, and how that led her on her career path. Let's dig in. Hi, how are you?
Hi, it's great to see you. I've missed you.
I've missed you too. I know. I feel like I'm cheating in this podcast initially because I'm just bringing in all these people that I know. I'm going to move into like people that I don't know soon enough. But initially I'm like, we were talking about being cozy earlier. Like I want to have these conversations with people that I feel cozy with, people I've sat around a fire with which obviously I've had the pleasure of doing this with you in Nova Scotia.
Yes.
I love being able to say this. Like, how do you know Betsy? Oh, I met her in Nova Scotia. It's like I'm big in Japan.
And do you realize that was only a year ago?
It was literally a little over a year ago.
A little bit over a year ago. And It's funny because I feel like I've known you forever.
I feel that way also, I love that. Okay, wonderful transition. We're going to get into this because we're going to talk about the idea of how we connect with people and the delta between doing it digitally. You know, we have I have a ton of digital relationships with people where it's like mostly through Instagram or through LinkedIn and you're like going back and forth. And then you have these connections with people that are predicated upon, you've met them in person and you find ways to meet up and all of that. So I'm going to start here. Question number one. This one I think gets everybody. I usually joke. I'm like, this is a real softball. It's really easy, but it's not easy at all. How, I know you're getting nervous now. How has your personal journey influenced your approach to leveraging technology within the work that you've done? I know, right? You just...
I wasn't expecting that question. There you go.
I know.
It totally threw me. So let's walk through that a little bit more carefully. How has my personal journey?
How has your personal journey influenced your approach to leveraging technology within the work that you've done? So, obviously, and I know, like, when I first met you, I completely gushed and fanboyed, and I was like, you don't understand what EdSurge meant to me and how it's changed my life, because it has. Like, I literally am not doing the work that I do or even feeling confident enough to have someone like you on a podcast without experiencing, benefiting, voraciously and addictively reading EdSurge for years and getting ideas and going in the shower and be like, oh, yes. And so even if we were just going to, compartmentalize this within your work within the edtech space, because you have this whole background as a journalist, which you can obviously talk about as part of this question. But the idea of leveraging technology, because I feel like we're from a certain generation, both you and I, where technology has just become a larger part of our lives. As opposed to people who maybe were born 10 to 15 years after us, where they had technology as a focal point as they came into this world.
So I'm going to disrupt your assumptions.
Ooh.
I'm sorry.
I love it. No, don't apologize. This is good. That's what makes it a conversation.
So you talked about personal journey. So here's my personal journey. My father, who in October turned 97 years old.
Congratulations.
Started working with computers in the 1950s. He worked in the Argonne National Laboratory, which at that point was doing very, very early work with computers with vacuum tubes. Mm-hmm. I literally have somewhere here in the office, I have a couple of mounted vacuum tubes that were of that era, because he worked with computers, with vacuum tubes, with huge reels of tape, with punch cards, that sort of thing. So the result is that, and then he stayed working with computers. He wound up working for a company called Perkin-Elmer, which built the first space telescope, the Hubble Space Telescope. But what it truly did was it actually worked on spy satellites all through the Cold War. So the result of that was, when I was in second grade, we had in our house a dumb terminal that connected to a mainframe that was working on how to spy on the Russians, mind you. But I did my second grade homework on a dumb terminal that was connected to a mainframe.
I'm going to pause you. I'm going to pause you for 1 second. One, obviously, I didn't know this. Do a lot of people know this about you, especially the second grade piece? Like, you're out there playing war games and doing spelling bees at the same time.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah. No, I don't think so. I mean, this is history, right? So, and the result, and the other thing that you have to know, again, you asked about personal journey. So, my dad, who was an engineer, was very interested in making sure that I understood how things worked. This can be a challenging way to be raised, I have to tell you, because this is a dad who made sure that I knew how to count in binary and hexadecimal. And so there was a point in my life where I could say, yep, I can program in exactly 2 languages, machine language and, sort of extreme high-end stuff. And so the result is that, like, my high school physics project was building a computer. Didn't work, but I did build one. And so the weird thing is that computer technology itself has been a part of my life since as long as I can remember, because of my dad. And more important than the actual physical stuff were the conversations that we had. So the conversations that I had with my father and have had for my entire life were always about the future. They were always about, what could this enable? What were the things that this could do? And the result is that, I wrote about technology in part because that was what I knew a lot about at that stage. I wrote about artificial intelligence in the 1980s. When it was not working.
Right.
And when there was a distinction between artificial intelligence and neural networks. And so the funny thing, Kwaku, is that technology has been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. And thinking about what it means and what our relationship to it is, and what it both enables us to do, but also where it creates problems. That has been fundamental to my entire life.
All right. So I think we've talked about this before. I love being wrong. Because it creates opportunities like this. Like, initially I was like, well, Betsy in my mind is like this magical person, and she's brilliant, and I love chatting with her, and she's in this tech space and this education and this tech space. So I'm going to ask her and see if she wants to be on this podcast. But what you just described, I love, because it is literally the epitome of what this conversation, what these podcasts are about, which is, one, how people connect with other people via technology, and where on that spectrum that lies, and then also how they're able to connect with other people. And I love the fact that this is grounded in the way that you connected with your dad. Because when I met you initially, I was like, I basically interviewed. I was like, tell me your life story. How did you get into this? Some people find that weird, but I just accost people that way. And so you told me about going to, grad school and working for the Boston Globe and then
Washington Post.
What's that?
Washington
Post. Excuse me. But you're even better, because I'm a New Yorker, so I'd rather you work for the Washington Post than the Boston Globe. No offense to anybody from New England, but New York forever. Anyway,
but yeah,
right. But the idea that you came from this journalism world, and it almost like, based on the initial conversation we had, it felt like you then shifted into technology, which is why I posed that initial question that way, because I didn't know this background, and the fact that like connecting to probably, I'm going to say at one point, the most influential man in your life had been through technology. And so the idea of connecting with other people through technology is not foreign to you.
Right. No. And I think that, I learned a million things from my dad. And you're absolutely right that he was huge and is still a huge influence on me. But he loved building things, and he loved experimenting with how far could we push it. So there was a way back in the 1980s. So recalibrate. Mm-hmm. Computers are based on a chip, right? A central processing unit. And that's kind of the hub that things go through, data goes through. In the 1980s, there were a handful of people who said, well, what if we had more than one chip? What if we had a whole bunch of these chips? And how would that work? This was a really different way to approach computer programming, to even think about problems. And it turned out that you had to think about problems differently when you had parallelism, and even more so when you had massive parallelism. Well, my dad was one of the first people who, as a user of these massively parallel systems, was working on that in the 1980s. Now, fast forward to today, a lot of the really interesting architectures are massively parallel or parallel to some degree. He was so far ahead of his time. And so I think he instilled in me an enthusiasm for asking questions, for thinking about what if, where if, how could we, all of those kinds of things. I mean, on my shelf, which, you can see I've got the bookshelf thing here too. I have early Marshall McLuhan, what's the meaning of all of this? Where does this take us? And those have always been the core conversations that we had growing up. He did coach my middle school basketball team. We had an astounding record. I think 0 wins in 15 games. So he wasn't really good at some of that stuff, right? He was good. I mean, we all loved him, and he bought pizza afterwards. He was not a particularly useful basketball coach, but he was marvelously curious about the world. And just to kind of bring it full circle, I recently, within the last year, I went to him and I said, Dad, I've got to show you what AI is currently doing. And so, I ran some of the demos and simulations that Google and OpenAI have done. And, people have two reactions to those things, right? They look at it and they go, oh my God, this is frightening. How am I going to know what's real? How can I, how the machines are taking over? Oh my God. That's one reaction. And my father at age 97 had a different reaction. His eyes lit up and he said, what an amazing time to be building this technology.
Jeez. That is, oh man. Okay. I'm going to struggle, I'm going to be honest, in this conversation, because I try to keep them under 45 minutes, under an hour. I am going to struggle because I have so many, I have like a list of questions, but as I said to you earlier, you're going to bring things up and I'm going to throw these questions out the window. One, and I don't think we talked about this. I had a bit of a similar background because my mom was a computer programmer for New York City, and she wrote a lot of the software that would basically enable people who worked for the city to get paid.
Very important.
And so, important job. And so as a kid, like around the house, we'd have all those cards around the house. And then when we'd go into work with her, she'd be like, and that's the mainframe. And I was like, okay, because I don't know what that means. And then we were the first kids to get a computer on our block.
Nice.
And so she bought like the Atari, because Atari had two computers. They had one that was just a gaming system and one that was a computer. And so at first she came home with the gaming system, and my sister and I were like, yo, this is amazing. This is great. And my mom's like, nope, I bought the wrong one. Took that one back.
Oh, that's painful.
Took that one back and came back with the actual computer. She's like, no, if you're going to use this, you're going to use a computer. You're not using this for games.
Your mom and my dad, they would have had such a moment together. Oh my God.
So there's this parallel thing that you're talking about, which is really, I mean, like, I'd like to be like, oh, well, I knew this was going to happen, and this is why I asked you to be here. But no, it's more of one of these really amazing coincidences. So I'm going to ask you this: the idea that your dad, a lot of your relationship with him tied into connecting over building things and asking what if and being curious. How does that translate into your ability to connect with other people? Selfishly, I love that about you because I feel like I do a lot of similar things. I hope at some point to the degree that you do it, but I ask a lot of what if questions and I'm really obsessed with that. So I'm curious about how, and I'm going to talk to you about how you do it with technology, but initially just like the result of technology is this frame that you have, that you see the world. How does that sort of connect to the way that you relate to people, the people that you find yourself in community with, that sort of thing?
Such an interesting question. I think that I am attracted to people who wonder about the world and who are building things. And I think I have a lot of patience because I have a lot of patience for the kinds of questions I ask, because I think when you're asking questions about the world, you can ask a lot and they can go in 50 million different directions. And I enjoy the conversation. I enjoy the playfulness of thinking about, well, where would this take us? Why would this work this way? What happens if, right? That's fun. That's genuinely fun. So my conversations, the best conversations that I have, like the ones I have with you, they're not transactional. I'm not trying to get anything out of
I love that. I love that.
I am trying to play, right? I am trying to intellectually engage and play and make mistakes and fall and imagine. And that's fun.
So to that point, and I think this might align with what you've just said. I've realized recently that I'm very much a verbal processor. So I'll read something, and so you know this about me. I get excited about books, and I send people books, and it's a great habit because it is an act of kindness, but also it is an excuse for me to be able to talk to that person about that book to gain a deeper understanding, especially through their lens.
It also that they feel obliged to read the book.
No, I mean you sent me books too, which and like the book, and I'm like it's like your book is next actually on my list because I just finished Nexus. Which this won't be on the podcast. You and I will have a separate call because I don't know if you've read it yet, but I need to hear your thoughts.
I have not, so make that a separate call.
So yeah, it's headed your way. Challenge accepted. But the verbal processing piece is something that I find that I do a lot. And I feel like in a way you're kind of describing that as well, like that wondering, and it may be about a book, but it may be just about larger questions. And a lot of us now are, a lot of the questions specifically around AI. What does this mean for jobs? What does this mean in schools? What does this mean for our sense of purpose as people, especially when you're confronted with something that you're like, oh, well, this is something I would have struggled with a couple of hours and produced something and felt really proud of myself about. And instead I spent maybe an hour coming up with the right question, which ties into the thing that you were saying about before with your dad, coming up with the right question. And then it's able to help me do it in 15 minutes after I've spent an hour coming up with a question. How do you find yourself? Oh, go on. Yeah. Ask your question.
Well, I was going to say, there's a woman who wrote a long time ago about urban planning and economics, Jane Jacobs. Have you read
I'm not
any of
familiar.
her?
No.
Okay, well, I'll send you her book too.
See? Love it.
And she wrote a lot about what creates innovation in cities. And she believed in cities. She lived in New York City, so she's a New Yorker. At one point, then she escaped to Canada, which probably wasn't a bad idea either. But she talked about sort of the mishmash of things that happen in a city, and how the person who builds A sees the person who builds B and thinks, oh, wait a minute, but that thing that makes it possible for you to push the cart that way, well, that could really work in my lamp or something like that. And that combination of pulling ideas from one area and seeing how they apply in another area, she argued was kind of at the heart of innovation. You will love Jane Jacobs. I do. And so I think of that a lot in conversation as well. It's maybe less about crafting the perfect question. I'm not sure I know how to craft the perfect question, but I do a lot of, well, what if we pulled this from here? And what if we pulled that from here? And how do those ideas combine? Oh, that one didn't work. Well, let's pull something else. What about that? And so one of the challenges that I had in college was I took a lot of very diverse classes, and it frustrated a couple of my professors. I started out as a physics major and discovered that I didn't actually know enough math to really do physics very well. So then I took math. I took physics for physics majors, and then I took chemistry for chemistry majors. And then my math caught up, and I wound up with a lot of math. And then I realized I actually was an economics major, so I sort of majored in economics, but I did a senior thesis in the history of science. So I was a total intellectual kind of garbage dump, in a sense, for all of these different ideas. But that's turned out to be kind of the way I think about the world, is I try to pull from all of these different areas. And I think that a lot of the conversations that I had, again, with my dad also did that. He was not an engineer by background. He actually had a degree in biology and English. And he wound up becoming an engineer because, like so many of us, he needed a job. And but he found that it was a great playpen for all of these different ideas.
So did we? All right. Now I'm just. This might even just turn into a books podcast. Did I send you Range? Did we talk about this book?
No.
Okay. So I'm going to recommend this book because the book is about the power of being a generalist versus being a specialist. And it actually aligns it with data, which it feels like there's a lot of that, which you sort of described in your sort of like academic history. And then I think also extends into what you've done professionally. And then even the piece of like the thing that you said about crafting the perfect question. I think that we were saying the same thing. I might have just phrased it the wrong way, because to get to that question, you are like, oh, and so if you're thinking about this in terms of using generative AI, at least the way I do it, all right, I need something in the sense of this from the perspective of that. And I need it in this tone. Actually, maybe I need it more in this sense. And the tone should be tweaked a little bit this way. That's the 40 minutes. That's what I mean by crafting the question.
That's exactly right. It's the iterative process of refining the question, refining the question. It's the follow-up question. And you're right, in terms of AI, that's what we're certainly seeing in terms of prompting, right? You can't just write one prompt and like, okay, I'm done. It's okay, I prompted you here. Now, what if I refine it? Oh, what if I go this way instead? And so, yes, then we are totally aligned that the perfect question is not the first one. It's the last one. And only because you took a somewhat peripatetic path to get there, but a path to get there.
And even the process And I don't know if we've talked about this, but I spent a long time as a professional musician, a touring musician. And so you would, when you're, at least for me, writing a song, was always about getting to the point that felt as good as the initial demo. And so, and if we're relating this to the question, the demo is like the first spark, the idea that you have where that like lights up the part of your brain where you feel curious, and you're like, oh man, okay. And then you start to hear things around it. And there's this, and everybody has a different process. So I'm not going to say this is general for anyone who writes a song, but for me, especially once, and this ties back into I guess the theme of the podcast, once, technology sort of, at least I caught up to how to use technology within the songwriting process. It would be like, all right, here's the idea. Let me take this sound and put this in here. Let me take this sound. And as I'm moving sounds around or changing in and out tones, then another idea would come up. And then the whole piece would shift. And so one of my favorite things to do after, I had completed a bunch of songs would be to A/B each finished song with the initial demo, because the middle part is what got me there, like the experimentation. And sometimes the song would shift in these really amazing ways, but I never had that original idea.
That's beautiful.
I
love that.
And so, well, okay, let me try to ground us a little bit more here. Okay, this is a really good question. I told you before, I have a bunch of questions I ask everybody. Do you have an instance or story that you can share where your use of tech in some way improved your ability to connect with an audience or a person? So what I just described was my example of that. If I, and I would do this, I think you've met my wife. I would play her demos and she'd be really played. She's like, oh, that's nice. And then a couple weeks later, after I'd done all of the moving of stuff around and I could hear the song differently and realize, oh no, it's really this that I'm trying to say or that I want people to feel. And then I'd play her that. She's like, wow, that's amazing. Did you just come up with it? And to me, I'm like, no, you heard this already. But that was an example of me being able to use music tech, using Logic and all of this other stuff to be able to bring in sounds of instruments I didn't own in the home, to be able to connect with her more with that song or to connect with an audience. Do you have examples of this within your work where you were able, and I mean, obviously generative AI is a really easy example that you could use, and you can use that if you want. But ways that you were able to utilize technology to really connect with people in a way that you weren't able to initially.
I'm going to think about that for a minute, hoping that you will cut out some of the blank dun 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 dun. Thinking.
Well, I'm also hitting you with all the easy questions, aren't
I? Using tech to connect with a person in a different way.
Or an audience. It doesn't have to be a singular person.
It certainly was the case in the early days of web browsers and email, that there was this giddy sense that I think many of us had of, oh my gosh, they're letting us out of the box, right? Because prior to, using first email and then web browsers, you were kind of stuck in your box, right? You had to pick up the phone to get a hold of someone or write them a letter or a fax. You remember faxes?
I do. That lovely sound it would make.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But connecting with people in email and then on the web was really interesting. And I think that there was in the early days. So again, you remember how the internet evolved, right? It started as the ARPANET as a defense. department project. It then moved to include universities. And so by the late 1980s, it was sort of still the ARPANET, but it was moving to universities. It got taken over by the National Science Foundation, became NSFNet briefly. And then it started to open up more commercially, and we started to have commercial servers and things like that. And then, of course, you also had AOL and whatnot. But those early days, so I started using email when I worked for a technical publication called IEEE Spectrum, because most of our authors were all working at universities or in the defense industry to some degree. And so we started using email back and forth. And there was this giddy sense of being a small community, relatively small community, that was figuring this stuff out for the first time. And figuring out both how to use it, and then figuring out how to talk about it with other people. So one of the articles that I edited, or maybe even possibly ghost wrote, was by a guy named Gordon Bell, who for a brief stint, Gordon had quite a long and rich background as a technologist. He was one of the early people at something called Digital Equipment Corp. And then he wound up running the NSF computer division at the time that they took over and ran the internet. And so he wrote an article for IEEE Spectrum about that. And I worked with him on, how do you tell the story? How do you explain this thing to other people in the world? And so it sounds kind of abstract. It's not as beautifully intimate and personal as you did, in sort of sharing your demos and stuff with your wife, but there was this sense of, we have to try to understand how to talk about this thing that's being built, these things that are starting to work. And it was cool to be a part of that, and cool to be trying to explain that to people who really had no involvement with computers, no involvement in communications technology. And it was an interesting challenge. And you would bring up metaphors, and we used to joke a lot. I really love metaphors. I love writing with metaphors. I'm sometimes guilty of using too many metaphors. But I was always trying to bring in metaphors that were not militaristic metaphors. It's always so easy for people to be warriors and, conquering things and so forth. And I was always trying to bring in some other metaphors, maybe like gardening or cooking. Let's talk about raising a community. And don't know that I was entirely successful with that. I think we got a lot more conquering going on than I would have hoped. But it was a really interesting moment of, how do you explain where the world's going? Does that help?
Okay. No, that's okay. Everything you say is gold. Do you remember the Seinfeld show? And it was Banyan.
Yeah.
It was like one of the ancillary characters. And the guy did the Ovaltine bit. He's like, it's gold, Jerry. It's gold.
Oh, thanks.
I'm your Banyan. No, I'm Banyan in this scenario. You're Jerry.
I don't know.
All right. So and this is me trying to not have 3-hour podcasts, because I've been guilty of this. Side note, I don't know if you've heard of the Acquired podcast. Someone turned me on to this the other day. They have a 6-hour episode. A 6-hour episode.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I have a friend who does podcasts, and he says his interviews always go for 6 hours.
Which is wild. I mean, there's bathroom breaks involved with this. I'm just, you know what I mean? You have to pause to have a meal, There are things going on. Yeah. All right. I had a bunch of this is going to be my last question for you. I know, right? Because you want to have a longer conversation. But, the first rule of show business, always leave people wanting more. People want more Betsy Corcoran. So we are going, we'll put a bunch of links in the show notes where people can figure out how to follow you and connect with you and follow your work, all of that. But I had a bunch of questions here, but But with what you've said, you've inspired me to ask you something else. So a lot of what you just described, and by the way, for people who don't know what the NSF is, that's the National Science Foundation. You know, I'm going to, in case people don't know what that term means. A lot of what you've described today has to do with asking questions, the process of seeking in order to learn, you know, in the way we're talking about, like asking the right questions and pulling things in, pulling things out, that sort of thing. So currently we are in this place where, similar to the beginning of the internet, so much is being defined within technology, but then as a result, also within culture through like a lot of the breakthroughs that are happening with AI. I'm really curious about the questions that you are asking right now and I'm gonna give you carte blanche to define what you feel like the direction, or even being able to relate to audiences the importance and the role of AI within society. It can be from education. It can be at large. It can be, you know, if you wanted to go there, it could be about politics, because it feels like there's a lot of what you do that is about asking questions in order to frame communication.
So thank you. That's an amazing opening. There's do you know the NPR show, It's Been a Minute?
Yes.
With, what's her name? Brittany Lewis. And she says, because culture doesn't happen by accident, right? She's got a great line like that. And I so appreciate that point. There are so many questions to ask right now. And it matters tremendously because AI isn't in a box. It's going to shape all of our lives, whether we know it or not. And so I think that the core questions, the really deep questions, have to do with, you know, what's the iceberg look like under the water, right? So AI systems are built, the current, you know, generative chatbot stuff is all backward looking. It's built on information that's been shared with it, the internet, YouTube videos, all this stuff, right? It's been informed by all of the past, but not everything in the past, right? People have made choices about
Great point.
What's in the box and what's not been in the box. My fundamental question is who's making those choices and what are they putting in the box? And how will that ultimately shape the recommendations, the comments, the things that come out the other end? I'll give you a very precise example too. You'll recall that a year or so ago, the New York Times sued OpenAI, saying, yeah, y'all have been using all of our content. That's called copyright violation. We'd like to get paid. You know, cough it up, guys. And as part of the legal filing for that, they included this vocative document, which was something on GitHub, which is, of course, a place where lots of programmers will post information and programs and try things out and so forth. Great resource. But they posted an early list of the 100 most relevant documents fed into a very early version of ChatGPT. It might have been ChatGPT 2, I think. And sure enough, guess what? New York Times, snap. If it wasn't the number one, it was the number two thing. And this was part of their legal document saying, look how much stuff they're using from ours. What I found even more interesting were the other 98 sources, and in particular, what wasn't on the list. There were no education news sites on the list. There was the New York Times and the Washington Post and things like that. But then there were a lot of things that literally reflected the specific interests of the people building the program. There was a lot about Magic the Gathering, Magic cards. There was a lot about Dota 2, which is a fine game. And I happen to accidentally know a ridiculous amount about Dota 2. But honestly, Education Week versus Dota 2, I would have put Education Week on the list instead of Dota 2 stuff, right?
Wow.
And so, and these are, in a sense, these are some of the DNA elements that have gone into building what will be a fundamentally important piece of technology. So now, I don't want to claim that everything that ChatGPT do is just based on Dota 2, although I know the Dota 2 guys are going like, woohoo, look at us. And obviously, these systems are voracious, right? The big problem OpenAI has is they need all of the words that are in YouTube in addition to everything that's on the internet and everything else. So, to some degree, I suppose it gets blurred out, but not entirely. And so what's in the box and what's not in the box? And who gets to build the box? Who gets to say you're in, you're out? To me, those are the fundamental questions, the starting questions, as we think about what are everything from the biases and inclinations of the recommendations that we get out of AI, to what kind of systems are we building? There's one other thing that I thought was fascinating and frightening. Okay, just damn frightening. There's a new book out that was co-authored by Henry Kissinger before he died, Eric Schmidt, the former chairman of Google, and a guy named Craig Mundy, who was head of a number of research programs and divisions of Microsoft for a long time. And they're all talking about the future of AI and so forth. And I watched the, 8-minute video or something that previews some of the book. And
when he's in Stanford, that video?
It was more of a pre-reel, so it was more talking heads. It wasn't, they weren't particularly at Stanford, but they have a lot of quotes from Henry Kissinger. And I think at some point Henry Kissinger, and I won't even pretend that I can do a Henry Kissinger accent, although it's so tempting. But at one point he says, well, maybe we're going to need to have, an AI that will give moral guidance to all the other AIs. Keep them in line. This is from a guy who was partially an architect of the Cold War, of our strategy in Vietnam. There are really big questions that we need to ask, and we don't need a single AI or even a single person to answer those questions. We need to find a way to answer them through community and through collaboration and through taking into account many ideas that people want to bring into the box. So it's a long answer to say, I care a lot about who's building, who are the makers, who's influencing the core instincts that AI will ultimately have, even as it evolves its own sets. And how do we make sure that all of us, because we're all gonna be affected by this, all have a voice? So that's... Can
I punctuate? Can I punctuate your answer?
Yeah.
Because someone just shared this quote with me and it's amazing. Because culture doesn't happen by accident.
Thank you, Brittany.
Wow. To be honest, if people don't know who you are, hopefully this is furthering this. I know that there are so many projects that you are working on. I know you're working on your own podcast. Yes. I don't know if you want to talk about that for a few minutes,
just to talk
minutes. About Please, because the reason I'm saying this is because people should have more Betsy in their lives. I'm sitting here thinking, why don't I talk to Betsy more? That's it.
Well,
that's it.
First off, thank you for asking lovely questions and great questions. And I actually want to hear you answer all these questions, because I think that would actually be more interesting than just hearing me. I am working on a podcast. It is in sympathy with yours. Ours is called Future Fluent. And it's my co-host is a guy named Jeremy Rochelle. He is a learning scientist at Digital Promise. And we're trying to explore the confluence of AI and literacy, which I know is a great topic for you, which is, in a world where the bots can read and write for us, why should we do all the hard work of learning to read and write, whether that's language or mathematics or culture? So how do we balance that? How do we balance AI and the work that it takes to actually learn stuff? And we don't have any answers, full disclosure, no answers here, but we are trying to ask a lot of questions. And I hope that we'll have a conversation with you too and ask you some of these questions.
A, I would love to be on that podcast. B, why I'm lettering this, I don't know. And C, I think it's way more important to ask a lot of questions than to have all the right words. I'm going to leave it there.
That's a great place to end.
Betsy, thank you so much. Thank you so much for bringing your time. Obviously, your brilliance. I don't think you ever leave that at home. I don't think you could if you want to. It's kind of like a shadow. And just your Betsiness. I just really, really appreciate being able to, one, call you a friend, two, being able to call you, and three, being able to have you on this podcast. And I need to figure out why I keep outlining everything, but that's a separate conversation.
Thank you, Kwaku. You are a delight. I have enjoyed every conversation and even read most of the books that you sent me. But I'm going to give a shout out to Jane Jacobs' work, which I think you might enjoy. Let's keep talking.
We definitely will. For those of you who made it all the way through this podcast, or whether you just watched like 2 or 3 amazing clips on some social media network, thank you for doing any part of that. This has been ClickPoint. We will see you next time. Thank you guys so much for listening.